Pull up a chair, my people. Lock the door. The paperwork just hit the wire and every phone in the culture froze mid-scroll at the exact same second. Rick Ross, the same Rick Ross who spent almost 2 years telling every microphone in reach that Set in Stone would be his coronation, just watched his own album belly flop onto the Billboard 200 like a cardboard box left out in the rain. And the man who called this exact ending 90 days ago, Curtis Jackson himself, has not blinked twice without sliding another quiet knife between the ribs of the moment. Rick Ross wanted a cathedral. Rick Ross got a graveyard. And you are about to watch, frame by frame, how a self-declared boss walked into his own wake in slow motion, on camera, while the entire rap internet stood outside with folding chairs and cold drinks. I've walked the receipts. I've walked the room. I've walked the wreckage. And by the time we close this file tonight, you will understand why this stretch of 7 days is not just a rough album week for Rick Ross. This is the week the entire luxury rap dynasty finally split open in daylight. Let me put the ledger in front of you, because the ledger tells the story the publicists will never tell. Set in Stone opened at number 39 on the Billboard 200 with roughly 19,000 equivalent units. 19 tracks. 14 features. And one Instagram caption from a rival that has already been screenshotted more times than the actual album has been streamed. Let that sentence sit on your chest for 1 second. A single caption from a competitor is outperforming a 19-track album from a certified legend. That is not a chart position. That is a tombstone. And before Rick Ross's press team could even huddle up to spin a counter-narrative, an unverified whisper began racing through the timeline that the first-day physical count came in as low as 2,000 copies. Was that number ever confirmed on paper? No. Did it need to be? Also no. Because a rumor with the right cadence always outruns a fact with the wrong one, and this rumor had the exact rhythm to become a meme before anyone even opened a calculator. You feel where I'm going with this. Rick Ross did not stumble by accident. Rick Ross rolled this project out like a foreign head of state arriving at a summit. He booked a global tour. He curated a car show that pulled 6-figure crowds. He ran the full podcast lap. He greenlit press across 3 continents. He constructed the exact promotional machinery that, on autopilot, is supposed to guarantee a top 10 debut. And still, when Monday morning arrived and the chart posted, the entire rap internet did the same collective double take at the same time. Because it was not just that Rick Ross missed. It was that Rick Ross missed while checking every box the old playbook demanded. That is not a bad week. That is a systems failure. That is the sound of an ecosystem quietly telling a veteran that the ecosystem no longer speaks his language. Like clockwork, Curtis Jackson stepped into the frame, because Curtis Jackson has been circling this exact calendar page for 18 straight years. The first post landed before the ink dried on the chart. 20 features under 10,000 sales. 1 crying laughing emoji. And a screenshot so clean it could cut a diamond. That caption traveled harder than any track on the entire album. Blogs pounced. Podcast hosts recorded emergency episodes at 3 in the morning. And before anybody could catch their breath, Curtis Jackson dropped a second post. This time answering the 2,000 copies whisper with a 7-word punchline that read like a jury foreman standing up in court. That is the Curtis Jackson method distilled. Say nearly nothing. Imply the entire universe. Let the timeline finish the paragraph on his behalf. Rick Ross is out here writing dissertations. Curtis Jackson is out here dropping emojis. And the emojis are running the scoreboard. Roll the tape back with me, because this is the part of the story that the mainstream commentary keeps stepping around. Rick Ross did not simply lose a sales race this week. Rick Ross lost a war he did not even realize he had enlisted in. And that war was not with Curtis Jackson. That war was with the architecture itself. The streaming architecture. The playlist architecture. The recommendation architecture. And that architecture, as several observers have started to murmur in the last 7 days, holds a very particular opinion about anybody who spent the last year and a half publicly poking Drake with a stick. Whether you buy that reading or not, the pattern refuses to be waved off. Every artist who camped on the anti-Drake side of the last conflict has watched their number sag. Every artist who leaned into anti-Drake framing has watched their playlist spots evaporate. Every artist who tried to surf the anti-Drake wave has, one way or another, ended up sitting exactly where Rick Ross is sitting right now. Empty rows in Miami. half-off code stapled to the tour. Refreshing Instagram at 3 in the morning to check what Curtis Jackson posted next. The timeline does not sleep. Within hours of the chart dropping, screenshots from Rick Ross's Miami tour venue began circulating and the picture was surgical. Green dot after green dot. Entire sections wide open. And then the piece that turned mockery into full-blown meme fuel, a buy one, half off the second deal that Rick Ross's own team quietly pushed out to keep the show from photographing like a ghost town on his own soil. Nobody was ready for that visual. Not the fans. Not the critics. Not even the podcast circuit that had been feasting on this beef for a year straight. Rick Ross has been many things over 2 decades in this game. A boss. A brand. A brawler. A businessman. What Rick Ross has never been, not in 20 years, is a half-price legend. And yet here we are watching Rick Ross's own team clip his own ticket prices in half like the arena was hosting a Black Friday clearance sale in the middle of a summer month. The mockery didn't stay online. The mockery colonized every podcast, every commentary channel, every microphone in the culture. Joe Budden's crew burned a full episode on the rollout. Academics broke down the stream counts on camera. Tony Yeo, still riding shotgun for Curtis Jackson 2 decades in, called the sales a self-inflicted wound. Uncle Murda folded the flop into his year-end rap before the year had even wrapped. And every single one of those voices arrived at the same conclusion in slightly different clothes. Rick Ross swung at a bear the size of Drake, and now Rick Ross is paying a tax he cannot negotiate down. That is the tribute tax epic in a single breath. Cross a fan base that size, and the fan base does not argue back. The fan base simply stops pressing play. And that streaming silence is worth more than any diss track anyone could ever cut in a booth. Now Rick Ross is not wired to sit still. Rick Ross does not do quiet. Rick Ross parked himself in front of a camera this week, leaned into the lens, and delivered the kind of speech that would sound cinematic if the numbers behind it wore a different shape. Rick Ross compared himself to Bosch, the Renaissance painter. Rick Ross said the value of art is not measured by a first-week bar chart. Rick Ross said set in stone was carved to outlive generations. Rick Ross reminded the culture that while some rappers were flipping 1 million units in 7 days, he was quietly moving 150,000. And yet Rick Ross is still standing here 2 decades later while most of those million first-week names are now clocking in at corporate day jobs. That is a legitimate argument. That is a defensible position. That is exactly why the timeline swallowed it whole. Because once the internet decides to laugh at you, dignity reads as denial, and philosophy reads as damage control. Rick Ross was not wrong. Rick Ross was simply late. Rick Ross needed to deliver that speech before the chart posted. Some of Rick Ross's defenders, and there are still plenty, have pushed back on the flop narrative with an argument worth respecting. Rick Ross has never been a first-week monster. Rick Ross has always played what veterans call the long game. Rick Ross earns his real money from touring, from licensing, from Wingstop, from the car show, from real estate, from every quiet business venture he has stacked brick by patient brick across 2 decades. A weak first week does not evaporate the mansion. A weak first week does not repossess the yacht. A weak first week is, in pure balance sheet math, a rounding error for a man diversified as aggressively as Rick Ross. That argument holds water. That argument is defensible. That argument is, unfortunately for Rick Ross, not the argument the culture is interested in having right now. The culture wants a body. The culture wants a punchline. The culture wants the fall it was promised the second Rick Ross squared up against Drake and Curtis Jackson at the same time. And here is where the story cracks wide open. Because when the smoke lifts, the sales chart is only the surface of what actually happened this week. The real story is what happened underneath it. Set in Stone is not just an album. Set in Stone is a stress test on the entire modern hip-hop machine. And that machine failed Rick Ross in ways that should keep every veteran with a project in the pipeline awake at night. Streaming platforms are no longer neutral referees. They are shaped by fan behavior, and fan behavior in this era is more tribal than it has been in 20 years. If you ride with Drake, you skip anything with a Rick Ross feature. If you ride with Rick Ross, you avoid anything that carries a Drake cosign. If you ride with neither, the timeline drags you into a camp before you even ask to join. That is not conspiracy theory. That is not paranoia. That is the emotional infrastructure of the streaming economy right now, And Rick Ross walked into that infrastructure with a 19-track project that could not decide whether it was a comeback, a diss chapter, or a business flex. 19 tracks. 14 features. Read that with me again. 14 out of 19. Rick Ross's own solo album is, in reality, about 75% guest verses, and that estimate is generous, because several of the technically solo cuts still hand their hooks and their bridges to other voices. What you are staring at is not an album in the classical sense. What you are staring at is a compilation project with Rick Ross's face on the cover, and Curtis Jackson smelled that from across the room the moment the tracklist leaked. That is the whole subtext of the 20 features under 10,000 sales caption. Curtis Jackson was not just clowning the numbers. Curtis Jackson was clowning the architecture. Curtis Jackson was pointing straight at the wobbling stagecraft of a veteran who had to invite 14 guests to his own dinner party and still could not fill his own dining room. Nobody in this business studies public embarrassment the way Curtis Jackson does. Curtis Jackson has been quietly logging Rick Ross since the Officer Ricky documents surfaced, since the baby mama drama, since the Miami parking lot shootout, since every stumble the man has ever taken. Curtis Jackson has built an entire second career out of Rick Ross's setbacks. So when Set in Stone finally cracked, Curtis Jackson did what Curtis Jackson always does. He didn't attack the man. He attacked the moment. Curtis Jackson posted the screenshot. Curtis Jackson posted the caption. Curtis Jackson tagged nobody, quoted nobody, argued with nobody. He simply held up the mirror and let Rick Ross see the reflection while the entire timeline watched over his shoulder. Rick Ross's response, when it finally arrived, was the exact response Curtis Jackson wanted. Rick Ross went on Instagram. Rick Ross went on podcasts. Rick Ross climbed on stage. Rick Ross defended himself over and over. Rick Ross said the streams were still climbing. Rick Ross said the physical numbers were still coming. Rick Ross said next week's chart would flip the story. Rick Ross said the anniversary tour was still moving. Rick Ross said the touring money, the licensing money, the business money would dwarf whatever the album registered. He said everything a boss is supposed to say. And every single time Rick Ross opened his mouth, the Curtis Jackson caption climbed another rung. Because in modern hip-hop, if you have to explain the flop already won the round. On schedule, the timeline lit up with punchlines, screenshots, and side-eyes, and the cross-comparisons began flying. Larry June, whose own project dropped inside the same release window, reportedly outsold Set in Stone first week. That single sentence turned into a meme within hours. Rick Ross getting outsold by an independent artist known for smooth, low-volume delivery is not just a chart footnote. Rick Ross getting outsold by Larry June is a cultural pivot moment. It signals that the modern listener is quietly walking away from the maximalist, features-heavy, luxury rap format Rick Ross helped invent, and walking toward artists who arrive with less noise and more intention. That is a shift, not a fluke. And Rick Ross sitting at number 39 on the chart is watching that shift unfold in real time from the wrong side of the room. Whether that framing lands or not, one thing is impossible to argue against. Rick Ross did not just lose a sales race this week. Rick Ross lost the narrative war he has been trying to steer for the last 2 years. The moment Rick Ross planted himself in the Drake conflict on the opposite side of the tracks, Rick Ross wagered the loyalty of every listener who had ever pressed play on a Ross-Drake collaboration. That was millions of listeners. That was billions of streams. That was, in cold business terms, an audience the size of a mid-tier country. And Rick Ross bet all of it on the assumption that Drake was about to collapse. Drake did not collapse. Drake regrouped. Drake released Iceman. Drake kept the fan base intact. And now Rick Ross is standing on the wrong side of a war he did not need to fight, holding a 19-track album that most of his former listeners refused to open. Circle back to the artery of this story, because this is the part the highlight reels keep skipping. When Rick Ross sat down with Joe Budden this past week, the internet didn't clip the music segment. The internet clipped the Drake segment. Every viral snippet from that appearance was Rick Ross being asked about Drake, dodging Drake, sidestepping Drake, and refusing to either fully continue the beef or fully walk it back. That in itself is a tell. If Rick Ross truly had confidence in the album, Rick Ross would have used the platform to talk about the album. Instead, Rick Ross used the platform to justify his position on Drake, which the recommendation engine reads as another signal that Set in Stone is really a chapter in the Drake war rather than a standalone artistic statement. Platforms reward statements. Platforms punish conflict extensions. Rick Ross, once again, walked into the wrong lane at the wrong moment. The wildest part of this whole cycle is that Rick Ross keeps handing Curtis Jackson fresh raw material, and Curtis Jackson keeps repackaging it faster than any comedy writer's room could dream of. When Rick Ross's venues showed empty seats, Curtis Jackson posted them. When the discount codes leaked, Curtis Jackson posted them. When the 2,000 copies whisper hit the wire, Curtis Jackson posted the screenshot with a laugh emoji. When Rick Ross tried to compare himself to Bosch, Curtis Jackson didn't even need to type a word. The timeline did the work for him, and Curtis Jackson simply reposted the mockery with one crying laughing emoji. That is the difference between a rapper defending his image and a rapper who has already banked the win. Rick Ross is defending. Curtis Jackson is harvesting. And every day this cycle drags forward, Curtis Jackson's brand expands and Rick Ross's brand contracts by the exact same margin. None of this means Rick Ross is finished, and that is the honest part of the story nobody in the comment section wants to admit. While the memes are still flying, Rick Ross is not finished. Rick Ross is bruised. Those are two entirely different words with two entirely different consequences. A finished artist cannot tour. Rick Ross can tour, and even a discounted arena will still fill with diehards. A finished artist has no revenue. Rick Ross has Wingstop, publishing catalog, real estate portfolios, sponsorship deals, and a car show that pulls in 6 figures a weekend without breaking a sweat. A finished artist cannot pivot. Rick Ross can absolutely pivot, and within 6 months he can release a 9-track project with one perfect feature and reset the whole conversation. The Rick Ross empire is not collapsing. The Rick Ross empire is being publicly humbled. And there is a real distinction between humbling and burial. But, and this is the piece the culture needs to hear, if Rick Ross does not read this humbling correctly, if Rick Ross keeps chasing old feuds instead of new fans, the humbling absolutely graduates into the burial. Rick Ross has watched other veterans miss that exact transition, and Rick Ross is not immune from missing it either. And now we arrive at the Drake shadow, because no honest conversation about Set in Stone can dodge the man whose name is nowhere on the tracklist yet somehow on every conversation about the tracklist. Drake did not diss Rick Ross this week. Drake did not comment on Rick Ross this week. Drake did not post about Rick Ross this week. Drake did not need to. The absence of Drake from Rick Ross's album is the loudest note on Rick Ross's album. Every previous Rick Ross project that truly mattered, Teflon Don, Mastermind, Rather You Than Me, carried at least one Drake feature and at least one anthem tier record. Aston Martin Music. Stay Schemin'. Diced Pineapples. Gold Roses. Every one of those records outran any Rick Ross solo cut in the same decade. Every one of those records was a Drake cosign wrapped in Rick Ross branding. And every one of those records is missing from Set in Stone, because Rick Ross torched the Drake cosign lifeline the moment he decided a public feud was worth more than a public partnership. That single decision, more than any streaming platform, more than any Curtis Jackson post, more than any half-off ticket code, is what actually cratered Set in Stone. Rick Ross did not lose because his pen slipped. Rick Ross's pen is still one of the sharpest in the entire genre. Rick Ross lost because Rick Ross underestimated exactly how much of his own catalog had been riding on Drake's back the entire time. Pull the Drake cosign out. Pull the Drake fans out. Pull the streams out. Pull the sales out. Pull the venues out. And suddenly Rick Ross is running half-off codes in Miami while Curtis Jackson is laughing at screenshots on Instagram. The domino chain is that simple. And Ross laid his own trap, one press interview at a time. Every time Rick Ross said Drake did not write his own lyrics, Rick Ross tipped a domino. Every time Rick Ross called Iceman horrendous, Rick Ross tipped a domino. Every time Rick Ross gave the Ross Drake audience a reason to choose a side, Rick Ross tipped another domino. By the time Set in Stone hit the streaming platforms, the last domino had already fallen, and the album was releasing into a room Rick Ross had personally emptied. That is the story nobody is telling with this level of clarity, but that is the story. Rick Ross was not ambushed. Rick Ross ambushed himself, slowly, publicly, on camera, across 2 years. Meanwhile, Curtis Jackson watched the whole operation like a hawk on a phone line. Curtis Jackson said years ago that Rick Ross would eventually buckle under the weight of his own borrowed shine. Curtis Jackson said the features would evaporate. Curtis Jackson said the tour would shrink. Curtis Jackson said the streams would fall off a cliff. Every one of those predictions has now landed inside the same 7-day window, and Curtis Jackson is not being humble about it. Curtis Jackson posted the sales screenshot next to a montage of his own multi-platinum plaques. He posted the empty venue photos next to his own G-Unit reunion tour receipts. He tossed his own predictions into the fire and poured accelerant on top. The whole timeline morphed into a Curtis Jackson highlight reel this week, and Rick Ross was cast as the losing team in the highlight package. Round after round in a war that refuses to end. This is now the 18th year of Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross, and the scoreboard is not even close. Curtis Jackson has outlasted, out-trolled, and out-earned Rick Ross across nearly every measurable category: television shows on multiple networks, a liquor empire, film studios, a G-Unit reunion tour that sold out arenas without a coupon in sight. And most importantly, Curtis Jackson owns the psychological lane. That is the piece you cannot buy back. Once a rival owns the mockery lane, the mockery compounds forever, and the audience will lean into it every single time the rival drops a new project. Rick Ross has been fighting that gravity for 18 straight years. This week, the gravity finally clamped down. Now, hip-hop is bigger than any feud, and the culture will absolutely hand Rick Ross more chapters. Rick Ross is not the first legend to face a public humbling, and Rick Ross will not be the last. Jay-Z faced it after Kingdom Come. Nas faced it after Nostradamus. Lil Wayne faced it after multiple album delays. Every one of those veterans found their way back. And every single one of those veterans did it by shrinking the scope of the next release instead of inflating it. That is the lesson Rick Ross needs to steal from history, and he needs to steal it fast. Do not drop another 19-track compilation. Do not chase Drake. Do not chase Curtis Jackson. Do not chase the algorithm. Drop 9 tracks. Drop one perfect record with one perfect feature, and let the culture rediscover why Rick Ross ever mattered in the first place. That is the recovery blueprint. Everything else is noise, and Rick Ross has had a very noisy week. But this is where the paradox becomes real. Rick Ross has never been famous for shrinking. Rick Ross is famous for expansion. Rick Ross is famous for maximalism. Rick Ross is famous for the mansion, the yacht, the fleet, the horses, the ostrich, the 20,000 square foot Georgia estate. The whole Rick Ross aesthetic is engineered around the philosophy of more. Asking Rick Ross to release less might be asking Rick Ross to become a different artist entirely. That is the trap Rick Ross is standing inside. The brand that built Rick Ross is the same brand now dragging Rick Ross underwater. The maximalist frontman cannot pivot into minimalism without losing the aesthetic that made him iconic. And the aesthetic that made him iconic is exactly what is misfiring in the streaming era. That is the Rick Ross paradox in one paragraph, and it will not solve itself inside a single news cycle. That is also why the mockery from Curtis Jackson lands so surgically. Curtis Jackson is not just mocking a bad first week. Curtis Jackson is mocking an entire business philosophy. Curtis Jackson is essentially saying, with every post, that the era of the luxury rap frontman is over and the era of the ruthless media operator has arrived. And Rick Ross missed that pivot by a full decade. Curtis Jackson pivoted into television. Curtis Jackson pivoted into production. Curtis Jackson pivoted into distribution. Rick Ross pivoted into Wingstop, which is real money, but is not the same lane. Every time Curtis Jackson posts about a new television deal, a new liquor line, a new film financing arrangement, the gap between the two men widens by another business quarter. This week, that gap became visible in a way no press release can spackle over. The saddest part of the whole cycle might be that Rick Ross saw it coming. Rick Ross has been unusually defensive in interviews all year, referencing the Drake feud unprompted, referencing Curtis Jackson unprompted, dismissing critics who had not even criticized him yet. That is the posture of a veteran who already knows the numbers might not land. The audience can smell preemptive defense from 100 miles out, and the recommendation engine can smell it from twice as far. Rick Ross telegraphed this reception for months. The timeline just arrived on schedule. And yet, this is the part the laugh track engine keeps missing: there is still gold buried inside set in stone. There are moments on this album where Rick Ross's pen absolutely connects. There are lines that would trend on their own if the sales chart had not swallowed the discourse whole. There are hooks that could still ignite on TikTok in the next 6 weeks if the culture ever moves past the numbers. Rick Ross did not deliver a bad album. Rick Ross delivered a decent album into a room that had already decided to laugh at him. Those are two entirely different failures with two entirely different solutions. A bad album cannot be saved. A decent album received poorly can absolutely be saved, but only if Rick Ross stops feeding the laugh track engine long enough for the music to breathe. The problem is that Rick Ross does not know how to stop. Because stopping means silence, and silence in the attention economy feels like death to a brand built on volume. The other unspoken layer is what this moment does to Rick Ross's Miami legacy. Rick Ross has been, for nearly 2 decades, the most visible ambassador of Miami rap. Rick Ross handed Miami a national brand it had not held since the Uncle Luke years and made luxury rap synonymous with the Miami skyline itself. This week, the Miami tour venue is half empty, and every empty seat is a hairline fracture in that legacy. The city has not turned on Rick Ross. But the city is watching what happens when the biggest boss in the room can no longer sell out his own arena on his own turf, and the city, like every other city, will draw quiet conclusions about the future of the crown. At the same time, Curtis Jackson is doing something almost surgical in the background of every post. Every mockery drop has been calibrated. Every laugh has been strategic. Every screenshot has been chosen not for maximum cruelty but for maximum shareability. Curtis Jackson is not just clowning Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson is building content. Every post drives followers. Every follower drives streams for Curtis Jackson's own catalog, which just happens to be moving beautifully in the same week Rick Ross is faceplanting. Curtis Jackson has turned Rick Ross's flop into an unpaid marketing campaign for the Curtis Jackson brand, and Rick Ross is unwittingly financing that campaign by refusing to log off. Every Rick Ross rebuttal hands Curtis Jackson another content cycle. Every Rick Ross response hands Curtis Jackson another headline. The math is brutal. The math is one-sided. And the math is not shifting until Rick Ross changes his behavior, which he has shown zero interest in doing. Rewind with me one more time, because the timeline never sleeps, and this whole narrative could still flip inside the next 30 days. That is the beauty and the danger of the modern hip-hop cycle. A single viral moment can rewrite a story that looked buried the day before. If Rick Ross drops a surprise single with the right feature, not Drake, obviously, but a strategic left-field partnership that catches the culture off guard, Rick Ross can reset the whole conversation before the first week even closes on the Billboard side. If Rick Ross drops a documentary, a business announcement, or a genuinely shocking revelation on his own timeline, Rick Ross can absolutely take the frame back. The Rick Ross brand is too big, too established, and too well-funded to stay pinned under this narrative forever. The real question is not whether Rick Ross can escape. The real question is whether Rick Ross has the discipline to escape without lighting another fire on his way out. For Curtis Jackson, the math is different. Curtis Jackson does not need Rick Ross to recover. Curtis Jackson does not need Rick Ross to respond. Curtis Jackson does not need Rick Ross to do a single thing. Curtis Jackson has already banked the win. Every future Rick Ross release will now be measured against this first week number, and any project that debuts under 19,000 units will simply be filed under still flopping. That is the trap Curtis Jackson has quietly closed around Rick Ross's future. Set in Stone is no longer just an album. Set in Stone is the yardstick. Set in Stone is the ceiling. Set in Stone is the humiliation benchmark. Rick Ross will have to drop a project big enough to erase this number before the culture forgets it. And the culture, being what it is, will not forget it easily. Meanwhile, the Drake camp is doing exactly what the Drake camp always does in moments like this. Absolutely nothing publicly, and almost certainly everything privately. Drake does not need to post. Drake does not need to speak. Drake does not need to gloat. Drake's numbers are talking loudly enough on their own, and Drake's silence is a form of competence Rick Ross's side cannot manufacture on a good day. That silence is strategic. If Drake commented on Rick Ross's flop right now, Drake would hand Rick Ross a lifeline. Rick Ross could redirect the whole narrative into a fresh Drake beef and steal back the cycle. By staying silent, Drake denies Rick Ross the oxygen. That is the exact discipline Drake showed during the Kendrick chapter, and it is the discipline Rick Ross has never been able to learn. Rick Ross will comment on anything. Rick Ross will react to anything. Rick Ross will feed anything. That is why Curtis Jackson keeps beating him, and that is why Drake keeps outlasting him. The last question, the one the timeline is quietly circling this week, is what happens to Rick Ross the human being once the news cycle finally rolls forward. Rick Ross has never publicly cracked. Rick Ross has never publicly wavered. Rick Ross has always projected the same immovable boss energy from the yacht, from the mansion, from the studio. But even bosses have private moments, and private moments do not stay private forever in the current media environment. If a single leaked clip shows Rick Ross rattled, the mockery cycle triples in a day. If a single associate leaks a phone call, the mockery cycle triples in a day. Rick Ross's brand is now in a defensive posture whether Rick Ross admits it or not, and defensive postures always eventually crack, because the pressure only comes from one direction. Curtis Jackson knows this. Curtis Jackson counts on this. Curtis Jackson has been circling this exact moment for 18 straight years, and Curtis Jackson is not about to release the pressure now. When the smoke lifts from this entire week, 3 things are undeniable. First, Rick Ross took a first-week loss that will follow him through the rest of this album cycle like a receipt stapled to his back. Second, Curtis Jackson extracted maximum content, maximum mockery, and maximum brand growth from that loss with clinical precision. And third, Drake, without lifting a single finger, remained the invisible king whose absence from the Rick Ross tracklist told the entire story before anybody even read the first review. Those are the 3 truths. Everything else is opinion, spin, or timeline noise. But those 3 truths, taken together, describe the exact shape of the modern hip-hop hierarchy right now, and Rick Ross is sitting on the wrong side of all 3. So the real question, on your side of the screen, is not whether Set in Stone was good or bad. The real question is whether Rick Ross can survive the next 30 days without stacking another log on the fire. Do you think Rick Ross should log off, cancel the press run, and let the album breathe? Do you think Rick Ross should double down, drop a diss track, and turn Set in Stone into a full-scale war project? Or do you think the cycle is already too far gone, and Rick Ross should quietly retreat into the business ventures that have been paying the real bills the whole time? Drop your verdict in the comments, because your answer to that question is going to shape the next 12 months of Rick Ross's career, and the timeline is genuinely split on which direction he should walk. Some fans want the boss to fight. Some want him to retreat. Some are already lighting candles at the Empire's gate. One thing is impossible to ignore. Curtis Jackson is not done. Curtis Jackson has more posts loaded. Curtis Jackson has more screenshots in the reserve. Curtis Jackson has an entire 18-year archive of ammunition, and Curtis Jackson has never once, in all those years, missed a chance to reload when Rick Ross handed him the opening. Rick Ross handed Curtis Jackson a very wide opening this week, and the next round of mockery is already loading in the background. Whether Rick Ross wants to acknowledge it or not, this feud is stepping into its most dangerous chapter yet. Not because Curtis Jackson is angry, but because Curtis Jackson is entertained. And an entertained Curtis Jackson is the version of Curtis Jackson that has always done the most damage. This is the quiet gravedigger era of the beef. Rick Ross should tread the next 30 days like a man walking across cracked glass, because every step is being watched, screenshotted, and prepared as future content for a rival who has out-strategized him for 18 straight years. And yet, if there is one lesson this business has taught us over and over again, it is that hip-hop reinvents itself faster than any other genre on the planet. Careers that looked buried have come back. Artists who looked finished have returned. Numbers that looked catastrophic have been erased by a single hit dropped at the right moment in the right room. Rick Ross has one shot to write that next chapter. The question is whether Rick Ross uses that shot on another Drake diss or whether Rick Ross uses that shot on a real artistic reset. The culture is watching. Curtis Jackson is watching. Drake is watching. Every rival, every fan, every commentator, and every recommendation engine is now watching his next move more closely than they have watched him in a decade. That is the only silver lining hidden inside this whole disaster. Rick Ross finally has the culture's full attention again. What Rick Ross does with that attention is going to decide everything. 20 years of legacy is stacked on the table, and the next move is not optional. Rick Ross has to swing, and Rick Ross has to swing correctly. Because if the next release lands anywhere near 19,000 units, the quiet gravedigger will not need to post another syllable. The number itself will finish the sentence, and the timeline will file the eulogy. If you rode this far with me, you already know this story is nowhere near closed. Tap that like button. Drop your prediction in the comments. Tell us who you really think is running hip-hop tonight, Rick Ross the Maximalist, Curtis Jackson the Quiet Gravedigger, or the Invisible King whose name is on none of the tracks and yet somehow all of the headlines. Subscribe so you catch every twist the second it lands, because the next chapter is already loading, and when it drops, you are going to want to be here for it. Something even louder is coming next week, and once you see who is involved, this Rick Ross cycle is going to look like the opening act. That is the ledger. That is the whole ledger. I'll see you on the next one. Peace.